Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Door County model Son et Lumiere, or as we say in the United States, the Door County model Sound and Light Show. During the hour-long presentation, we prefer that no one leaves his seat, nor is there any smoking. Thank you. And now, on with the show. It is 11,000 years ago. The Arctic Ocean has frozen over, setting in motion the great Labrador ice sheet. It gathers momentum and picks up the boulders, trees, plants, and animals in its path and carries them relentlessly in a southeasterly direction. It is 8,000 years ago, and thawing and draining are finally taking place. As the glacier, a 2-mile thick blanket of packed ice and snow descends, twin fingers carve out Green Bay and Lake Michigan, but cannot erase the Niagara Escarpment between. As the floor of the lake and bay begin to rise, free of their glacial burden, the Door Peninsula emerges triumphant, rubbed raw, but rising visibly from the depths.
In the intervening years, life grew profusely on the peninsula. Trees, plants, and animals thrived, and when the Indians came, they called it a land of plenty and made their camps. Washington Island and Rock Island above the tip, Rowley's Bay and Ellison Bay, Egg Harbor, Jacksonport's Hibbard's Creek, Sturgeon Bay, and 75 miles away in the town of Green Bay were Indian encampments. Wisconsin's historic register now lists at the tip of the peninsula Port des Morts. Remains have been found of the North Bay culture of the Middle Woodland period, followed by the Late Woodland and Mississippian cultures and the Oneonta groups. 300 years ago, the Winnebago reigned supreme. From Red Banks near Green Bay, they operated a tight little community. Mogashoots was the name of their village, and within its fortifications lived 3,000 fierce warriors who killed and ate their visitors and roamed the peninsula freely, hunting and fishing.
In 1634, Champlain, governor of New France in Quebec, Canada, 1,000 miles away, heard tales of these Indians and the saltwater bay on which they lived. Ever since Columbus had landed here, efforts had been made to find a waterway to the wealth of China and India. With high hopes, Champlain sent the intrepid explorer Nicolay to make peace with these savages. Equipped with a birch bark canoe, some friendly Indians to service it, parched corn and pemmican, which is dried beef jerky, to eat, they set out on the 1,000-mile trip up the Ottawa River, across 40 portages, over Lake Huron, into Lake Michigan, down the shore to Eagle Harbor, where they would camp and send an emissary to Mogashoots to inform them of his visit. Otherwise, Nicolay may have been a surprise addition to a Winnebago stew. The emissary returned. Nicolay will be welcomed. They paddled to the foot of the great cliff with a stockaded village towering above. This was the scene.
On the shore, naked savages clutched tomahawks. Great chiefs in ceremonial robes with much fur and many feathers. Indian women and children crowding for a glimpse of their first white man. The canoe touches shore, and a figure steps out in a robe of fine Chinese damask, brightly embroidered with colorful birds and flowers of the exotic East. On his head is his largest and finest beaver hat. And in each hand he firmly clutches a pistol. Slowly he raises his right hand. A great jet of flame shoots out and a thunderous report echoes back from the water. Women and children vanish. Slowly his left hand rises. The miracle is repeated. Brave warriors vanish as quickly. Only the chiefs remain. Nicolay moves forward, placing 2 forked sticks in the ground and lays a third across the top. On this he arranges strings of beads, bright ribbons, fabric in glowing colors, things the Indians had never seen. With gestures he indicates that they may have them, and they rush to see and take. And that is how Nicolay became friends of the fierce Winnebagos and spent a most productive winter trapping and hunting. He returned to Quebec in the spring with a full load of furs and promises of everlasting peace and goodwill.
But the warlike natures of the Winnebagos prevailed, and within 10 years of suffering and bloodshed, they paid the price for their cruelty. They were forced to flee to Lake Winnebago, far inland. The Potawatomi tribe of the peaceful Algonquins now moved up the peninsula and settled at Hippert's Creek, just north of Jacksonport, and founded their village name Meshengen. In 1651, an event occurred that decided the fate of America's French dominion, and it happened in Meshengen, where Jacksonport is now located. The Iroquois Indians were even more savage than the Winnebagos, and to make matters worse, the Dutch settlers in New York had traded them guns. The French had never done that, so the Midwestern Indians were really frightened. As relentlessly as, and a lot faster than, the Labrador ice sheet 11,000 years ago, they traveled southeasterly, wiping out both Indians and pioneers in their path. Their aim? To vanquish the French and set up their own kingdom. The Ottawas and Hurons living in the northern part of the peninsula and on Washington and Rock Islands came down to the Potawatomis at Meshengen for sanctuary. All together, they might stand a chance. 4,000 strong, they built a secure fortification around the village. They planted and harvested corn and vegetables. They hunted and fished and dried and preserved their stores against the siege they knew was coming.
By 1653 they were prepared and awaiting the evil day on which the Iroquois would arrive. One day in the spring, they heard them storming in, pounding on the triple stockade of green timbers. In vain. "We'll starve them out," cried the fierce Iroquois, only to be starved themselves. They ranged the forests and the streams, searched the cornfields, and wondered where all the plenty they had heard about had gone. Within a month, the Iroquois sued for peace. Graciously, the Potawatomi agreed, conditionally upon the release of their prisoners. The Iroquois agreed, and the date of departure was decided upon. The victors even promised a corn pone apiece on the morning they left. Inside each, they mixed a strong poison, unbeknownst to the Iroquois. There happened to be within the fort a Huron woman who once had been captured by the Iroquois and had had a son, left behind when she escaped. Looking out through a slit in the stockade, she recognized her son among the Iroquois and blurted out the truth about the poisoned corn pones. The next morning, when the food was thrown over the fence, the starving Indians ran to catch them, but their chief stepped forward and grabbed one and fed it to a dog. who shortly died in agony. Totally humiliated, the Iroquois left. Some who went directly up the peninsula and home through the Straits of Mackinac were set upon and killed. The rest had gone south to be killed by the Illinois tribe. And so the arrogant Iroquois were in no position to challenge French supremacy, and the Battle of the Door saved Canada for the French.
A year later, again in the spring, a large flotilla loaded with furs traveled through the straits and peace was restored. Green Bay became a center of the fur trade and the peninsula its prime source. The southeasterly path from Canada ran down the St. Lawrence River into Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, Lake Huron through the Straits of Mackinac and thus to our peninsula. It became known as the pathway to the west, and through it streamed the voyageurs, French adventurers and trappers, and explorers like Joliet and Marquette, La Salle and Hennepin, and Catholic missionaries like Father Alloway, who settled near Green Bay and De Pere. So the peninsula became the door to the west, and we call it the Door Peninsula today, but for another reason. There is an Indian legend about the Porte des Morts, which is literally the door of death. Porte des Morts is the passage between the tip of the peninsula and Washington Island, and it is here that Green Bay waters from the west merge with the Lake Michigan from the east. Because of this coming together of the waters, the currents are very dangerous. The legend tells of the peaceful Potawatomi who lived the good life on the peninsula with plenty of food, who were being chased at one time by the Winnebagoes, who wanted the forest and streams all to themselves. The Potawatomi sadly left for Washington Island, but even so they lived in fear. It was directly across the Porte des Morts from the peninsula, so they drew up a counterattack of their own. Stealthily, under cover of darkness, 3 spies were sent to the mainland to light a fire where a safe landing could be made. Soon the firelight glowed, and the Potawatomi eagerly paddled their canoes across the strait, certain they could carry off a surprise attack. But they had no chance. The Winnebagoes had captured their spies, lit a fire on the cliff, and were waiting for them at the foot of the cliff in the water. But they were all attacked by the same fierce winds and currents, and none survived. After such carnage, the Indians believed they must never again cross death's door. The French explorers gave it the name of Porte des Morts, and the peninsula became known as the Door.
Louis André was the first Catholic missionary to come to convert the Indians. A large wooden cross was erected in or near any village where converts had been made. By 1680, the fur traders and voyageurs had corrupted the Indians with whiskey and bad business deals, and they no longer trusted white men, so the missionaries left. One cross remained for the pioneers to see by the Mink River and Rowley's Bay in the northern part of the peninsula. The 6 wooden steps leading up to the cross still remain. Some settlers, coming in 1675, held their services outdoors before the cross. Near the Ephraim entrance to Peninsula State Park, there stands a totem pole from the Door County Historical Society as a memorial to our Indian heritage. Nearby is the grave of Simon Kakados, the last Potawatomi chief. Also buried on the peninsula in Egg Harbor is Roy Oshkosh, the last titular chief of the Menominee Indians. They, too, had been a part of Door County with a large village at the foot of the bluff in Egg Harbor. Chief Oshkosh had a trading post, which is still there, and held powwows around a campfire, telling Indian lore and teaching their dances to many children from 1939 to 1974, when he died. The Potawatomi and Menominees were also encamped in the Sturgeon Bay area. At that time, the sturgeon was so plentiful that the Indians stacked them on the shore like cordwood. This is how Sturgeon Bay received its name. Where the Sturgeon Bay Canal is now, there was, in the glacial period, a great river. It filled in, and when the Indians and later the pioneers came, they had to portage their canoes across, since nothing but a stream remained. Chief Oshkosh told the story that the sturgeon were so profuse that the Indians could walk across the stream on their backs.
In 1679, the largest sailing vessel to have sailed an inland waterway, the Griffin, was built by LaSalle to ply the fur trade and to carry passengers to the west. The Indians on Mackinac Island were really frightened when they saw this huge ship gliding on the water with no paddles. They thought it might be a slave ship, and so they spread the alarm to the nearby Indians, and plans were laid to capture the Griffin. LaSalle had stocked the ship with a winter's load of furs from Washington Island and was returning with them to Canada. Becalmed, just 2 days out of Washington Island, the boat lay at anchor. The story told is that it was boarded by the Indians. The crew were killed in their bunks, and the beautiful Griffin was a burnt wreck. It has never been seen again, and divers may someday bring it up from its watery grave. There is a park just south of Sturgeon Bay named after Robert LaSalle. He was a friend of the Indian and a frequent visitor and traveling businessman on the peninsula's shores.
Not much is known about Door County through the 1700s. When the pioneers came in the early 1800s, there were still many peaceful Indians and occasional fur traders, and peaceful, plentiful forests, rich in berries and game, and fish in the streams and lake. Increase Claflin, Door County's first settler, was an adventurer. His family originally settled in New York State, and his grandfather fought in the French and Indian Wars. His father fought in the Revolution, and Increase fought the War of 1812. He came west through New Orleans and up the Mississippi River, only to fight again in the Black Hawk War. By then, he had worked his way up to southeastern Wisconsin, so when he decided to find new frontiers, he took his family and his possessions on sleds over the ice to Little Sturgeon Bay, and found the land good and food available and conditions superb for horse racing. He had brought his horses along on the ice. He thrived. But his son-in-law caused trouble with the Indians, and things were uncomfortable for Increase with all of his Indian friends. So he headed up the peninsula to look for another farm. He found a promontory of land in a natural harbor. It is still called Claflin's Point and is in Peninsula State Park. Increase Claflin's house was, in 1844, the first on the peninsula.
In 1848, Captain Bailey sailed from Buffalo, New York, having traded his wheat for salt and immigrants. He made it through the Straits of Mackinac and, praise be, through the Port des Moors before the storm descended. He had a shipload of wailing and moaning immigrants, certain that their end was imminent, and his charts showed no bay nearby. But as he looked up, he saw a spacious harbor and decided to make a dash for it. It was wide and deep and protected by towering pines. They sheltered there for several days, till the heavy seas had passed, and his immigrants devoured hungrily the raspberries that he had found on the land. He took to Milwaukee some building stones and firewood that he found, marking the spot well for future riches. In 1849, Mr. Sweet, the owner of Captain Bailey's shipping line, purchased 115 acres in Bailey's Harbor and built a strong pier,
Also, in the Bailey's Harbor area is a natural phenomenon relating back to the glacial period. It is called the Ridges Sanctuary and is marked by range lights. When these lights are lined up one above the other, as seen from the lake, they guide ships in between the reefs. One remains and marks the entrance. When you stand on the beach here and face inland, a few miles away is a limestone bluff that once was a shoreline. This sanctuary is called the Ridges because in between are 16 small hills, each separated by a swamp or bog area. Each of these ridges was at one time a shoreline of a great sea, swept by wind and waves. As each receded, another shoreline became a ridge, with a swamp barrier to the next. The plants of these periods were deposited also, and growing on these ridges are 25 types of orchids, including subarctic varieties. These 1,000 acres tell the story of plant changes and successions from the Ice Age to the present. The 17th ridge, or swale, is even now being formed on the bottom of the lake, and the glorious Ridges Sanctuary is a national monument and zealously guarded by Roy Lukes, who, along with other naturalists, is available for daily tours.
In 1853, a band of Norwegian settlers and a Moravian minister, Reverend A.M. Iverson, came from Green Bay. They had a loan of $500 from some of Pennsylvania's Moravians for the purchase of land. They came to Eagle Island, 2 miles from the cliff where they decided to build their church. They lived in shanties on the island while they cleared the land in their town, which they named Ephraim, after a biblical town, also on the edge of the wilderness. The name Ephraim means doubly fruitful, and it was devoutly hoped that the land would prove good for them. It was hard work, fishing and clearing land and building homes all at the same time. But within the year, the 4 families and their pastor were all in their own homes. The land was another problem. Due to the ever-present rocks, it yielded so little that it couldn't even sustain a cow. After years of hard times, finally, in 1859, they finished their fine clapboard church, complete with a bell in the belfry. That bell has tolled each and every Sunday ever since, though the church has been moved from that bluff and added on to. It is now in Ephraim, and often the center of the town's activity. There is an unwritten rule that all of Ephraim's homes should be painted white, and it is largely adhered to, centering around the lovely white Moravian church. Reverend Iverson's home is still standing in Ephraim, too.
In 1844, Asa Thorpe, a lock tender of the Erie Canal in New York, hopped aboard a passing scow full of immigrants headed for the west. Asa was a cooper. Butter firkins, tubs, and barrels were his trade. He met a man who told him of the fishermen on Rock Island who were in desperate need of fish barrels for salting and shipping the fish that they caught. Asa was game, and he spent a profitable summer on the island. In the fall, he caught a steamer from Buffalo, heading for Green Bay, and soon was talking to the captain.
From Mackinac to Green Bay, there's not one pier for cordwood. The peninsula is one vast forest, yet there's no wood to be bought for fuel.
At that moment, the smoke from Increase Claflin's cabin hove into sight, and Asa noted the natural harbor and the good trees, and told himself he'd be back. He settled his affairs, and within a few years he was back, and built his pier and employed many men to chop the cordwood for the many steamers plying the Green Bay waters. By 1853, Fish Creek was a thriving fishing village. The first school on the peninsula was nearby in Ephraim. 2 ladies purchased a fisherman's shack and made it into Fish Creek's first church, an Episcopal chapel. It is still in summer use and stands near the shore in Fish Creek. Asa Thorpe had land to the southwest of the pier, on the water and backed by a cliff. For a long time it lay there unwanted because it was too rocky to farm. Asa finally sold it for $200 to Dr. Weckler of Marinette, Michigan, who built a hotel for the summer people who rode the Goodrich Line steamships from Chicago and Milwaukee. They preferred the cooler, fresher air of the country summers, and this section is now the neat and busy summer colony of Fish Creek. Jacob Thorpe, Asa's brother, was in Fish Creek making fish kegs for Increase Claflin. After several years, he married one of Increase's daughters and moved to Egg Harbor, 5 miles to the south. Their son Roy was the first recorded birth in the county. Levi Thorpe was the 3rd brother. He suffered gold fever and joined the 49ers in California for the gold rush. And he was one of the luckier ones, returning to the Midwest $6,000 richer. And he built the pier in Egg Harbor. He prospered in everything he did. And in the 1870s, he built the beautiful cupola house on Highway 42 for his family. It is still there, and from the cupola, the view is outstanding. It is fairly easy to guess how Fish Creek got its name, but Egg Harbor? This is one of the versions.
In the summer of 1825, Mr. Rolette, a prominent fur trader, who had wintered in New Orleans and sailed up the Mississippi and finally into Green Bay, was now on his way up to Mackinac with 2 of his other ships. He took on supplies and tents and full mess kits and lots of eggs. On the 2nd day out, nearing lunchtime, they found themselves across from a lovely little bay, and Captain Rolette gave the order to stop for a meal. It is maritime courtesy that when 2 boats approach a narrow harbor mouth together, one will drop back so that the captain's enters first. Sometimes, though, there is a friendly rivalry, and the other ship will make a run for it. That is what happened this day, and Captain Rolette decided to pull rank.
I order you back, sir. The captain is approaching and will enter first.
Mr. Kinsey held up a broom threateningly, as if he could hold the captain off with it.
Says you, sir. See this broom? It says you will fall back, not us, sir. You have asked for this, Mr. Kinsey.
And the battle of the eggs was on. There was much laughter and many screams as the eggs flew and the harbor was named.
It wasn't until 1853 that Egg Harbor was settled, though. Milton Lyman was the first to come and stay. He was a mystery man. He was very well educated. Why should he choose the wilderness? But a neighbor was welcome then, and why he came was his own business. He became the first county judge, superintendent of schools, and clerk of court. Eventually, he became justice of the peace, and was very well known as he traveled throughout the county. An immigrant from Norway settled on lower farmland 4 miles south of Egg Harbor in an indented cove which he called Horseshoe Bay because of its shape. He too built a pier and shipped cordwood and kept a store. A mill was built and a cooper's shop. and an ice company. Today, all that remains is Horseshoe Bay Farms and the Frank E. Murphy County Park, with a dock and a beautiful sand beach. When the Norwegian Moravians settled in Ephraim, there was a man from Bavaria with them. He happened to be in Green Bay one day and met many East German immigrants with no place to go but wanting to farm. He directed them up the peninsula, and there they found good farmland along Highway 57 north of Bailey's Harbor. And this strip of land became known as the German settlement. There is a barn and house built by August Dorn in 1860. The house has been added on to, but the original log cabin has been restored and is a fine example of the stovewood architecture of that period.
In Ephraim there lived a very stern justice of the peace named Jasper Moorfield. He had a way of handling cases that often made him laughable, and the evildoer consequently appear more sensible. This was a state of affairs that Jasper did not take lightly, and one day he had a brainstorm. He would leave this town and move further up the peninsula, where there weren't so many people, and set up his own town. With 3 able and willing Norwegians, he moved and called his new village Liberty Grove in honor of his newfound liberty to set standards as he felt they should be. What he failed to realize was that the Norwegians in his new town would insist on an election for town office, and they would win, since the 3 of them formed the majority. Poor Jasper, he was doomed to remain a justice of the peace. The township of Liberty Grove has within its boundaries Sister Bay, settled in 1871 by Andrew Sequist, Ellison Bay, settled in 1854 by John Eliason, and Gill's Rock, named for Elias Gill, whose deed was dated 1860, all offshoots of Ephraim. Up beyond Bailey's Harbor, near the tip of the door, is its only river, the Mink. Today, as yesterday when Father Alloway erected his cross, this is where the 6 kneeling steps were found. It is a fisherman's paradise. Mink River abounds with trout, northern pike, bass. If it swims, it's there, they say. And of course the wildlife is there, including the mink that gave the river its name. River may not be the right word for it. It's more of a sleepy lagoon falling into a gentle bay with Lake Michigan beyond. It is swampy land, full of cedar trees. Peter Rowley named it, but he was a confirmed hermit. If he could see the smoke of another fire, he felt crowded, and so he lived and died happily alone at Rowley's Bay. But first,
in 1834, John Brink was given the job of surveying Door County. Having traveled the length of the peninsula, he and his assistants found themselves in this vicinity in the fall of the year, low on supplies. This meant that someone would have to make the 75-mile journey to Green Bay before the snow fell. Jim McCabe was dispatched on this lonely trip, together with the pony Polly, and told to meet them near Death's Door in 3 weeks' time. Fortunately, Jim had an uneventful trip and was just a few miles from his rendezvous when disaster struck. He had made camp in a sheltered grove, and Polly was grazing just out of sight when some Indians found him.
Look, boots from army, deserter, trade him for firewater. We take 'em.
woke him up, loaded their canoe on him, and after a 5-mile portage, they sailed him back to Green Bay and proudly led him to Captain Arndt's Army headquarters, where finally, back at the trading post, they convinced the Indians that McCabe was not a deserter, and no firewater would be given to them, and they left poor Jim to start his 75-mile trek back without even Polly for company. It was a common practice at that time for Indians to help the Army track deserters and be paid in whiskey. Meanwhile, back in northern Door County,
Why doesn't McCabe bring the supplies? By God, we're down to nothing. I'm hungry, no powder, darn gun no good, can't get no meat, berries all gone. Where is that man?
and so they wandered, Brinks and his men, until they came to the Mink River, and great was their joy when they saw all the fish. 3 weeks later, McCabe still was not back. In Mr. Brink's own words, the next day McCabe appeared. He expected to find a rather sickly-looking lot of men, and if he didn't find what he thought he would, he certainly did find a fishy crowd, for we were covered with scales and smelled like the inside of a whale. But they survived, thanks to that river.
Now, in 1876, there appeared here a New Yorker named Mr. Rogers, who had traded his land in New York for a farm in Illinois, and traded that for 4,500 acres in Raleigh's Bay, Wisconsin. Seeing his swamp and Cedars land for the first time, he searched it for a source of income. Not having much choice, he put his faith in the Cedars and called for his friends. They built a pier and a sawmill, houses and stores. It was the young Cedars that bothered him. To what use could they be put? Finally, he had it. Cedar oil, selling at $8 a gallon. That was successful for 2 years when greed made the oil factory owner move to a more accessible area. Having raped the land to the utmost, Mr. Rogers, too, was ready to move on. He traded this land to a Mr. Ditliff Hanson of Tacoma, Washington, for a farm in Missouri, and moved on.
Seeing his raped and mutilated land, this thrifty Dane racked his brain for a use for his acreage. Remembering how Chicago was filling in the swamps near the lake and building upon it, he decided to fill in his swamp and build a town. Hansonville, he'd call it, or maybe Ditliff's Hope. And so he had lithographs drawn of his proposed city. Stores, schools, lovely homes all took shape on paper. And the name fell into place, Tacoma Beach. And back in Tacoma, Washington, he'd sell the lots. So he returned, and some old friends did buy some sites, but they didn't want to move so far away. So eventually Mr. Hanson gave up, went to Chicago, and sold the whole kit and caboodle to a Mr. Rosenstein. He turned out to be a persuasive salesman and sold most of the lots. When his customers set out to visit their lots, however, they came to a halt in Sturgeon Bay, since there were no roads for the final 30 miles.
No roads.
Eventually, the people refused to pay their taxes, and Door County absorbed the $5,000 loss.
In 1867, some men in Madison were made aware of the Hibbert's Creek area, where the Indian village of Meshingen had been. A man from the Federal Land Office in Menasha had told them about the valuable timber growing there, and soon they were planning their fortune. 2 of them had $7,000 to invest, but the third, Andrew Jackson, had the idea and the location, so he was taken in as the third partner. Since the land was located on the water, transportation would be no problem. They planned to sell lots, too, so they needed a name. Jackson as the owner of the idea was again honored, and Jacksonport had a name. 37 men were hired and set out through the snow with a well-stocked sleigh. The men, of course, had to walk and work to keep the sled upright amid all the stumps in the primitive road. Perry Hibbert now occupied the Hibbert Creek site of the actual Indian village, named after himself, and was the only white man between Sturgeon Bay and Bailey's Harbor. He had not only sold the Jacksonport men his shoreland for their pier, but also had supplied his barn for their dormitory. It was air-conditioned and proved a mite too chilly for the lumberjacks. The project was a disaster from the start. The so-called lumbermen proved to be lazy as well as inexperienced. They short-measured fence post orders and used soft wood because it was easier to chop. The recipients refused to pay, and things had reached an impasse. It took a skunk to solve the problem.
The skunk appeared one morning in the storeroom when the cook had come in to start breakfast. He was quite willing to let the skunk leave at his own pleasure, but the hungry men insisted that he be dispatched at once. And so the cook shot, and so the skunk died. And so the stores were ruined by the skunk's dying scent. A ton of butter, thousands of pounds of pork and beef, too much flour, and assorted groceries. New supplies were ordered, and even a week later, they too were ruined by essence of skunk, and the building was condemned. The men, poor specimens that they were, deserted the sinking ship. New men were hired, but the enterprise never got off the ground, and soon the company filed bankruptcy. 2 of the partners pulled out, but Tom Reynolds remained, having purchased 700 acres. He became Jacksonport's first farmer and permanent settler. The lumberjacks had tremendous appetites, and some desperate cook came up with a delicious and fast fill-up. Boil the plentiful fish with an onion for flavor and some filling potatoes for a one-dish meal that would fill up the men. Today, it's a Door County specialty, with everyone watching the outdoor fires. Just before it is finished, the fire is doused with kerosene so that the water boils up and spills over, removing the fish oils. Serve with coleslaw, Swedish limpa bread, and cherry pie a la mode for a memorable meal. Door County's fish boil.
In 1850, the first house appeared in Sturgeon Bay proper. Oliver Graham built it, and there were scattered homes in the area. It wasn't until 1874 that Sturgeon Bay was named. In 1862, Joseph Settle brought the first commercial apple trees, and they thrived. In 1891, at the Wisconsin State Fair, Door County apples attracted the attention of Arthur Hatch and Emmett Goff, who were orchard men. They introduced the tart Montmorency cherries to the peninsula, and they have become big business, though less so recently. In the 1800s, there was no canal, just a narrow, shallow strait, filled in with a narrow, sandy ridge, covered with pine trees. This was the portage used by the Indians and the explorers. In 1881, Joseph Hirst decided that there was a need for a shortcut between Lake Michigan and Green Bay waters nearer at hand than at the dangerous Port des Moors. A group of far-sighted businessmen finally had the canal dug. In 1893, the government bought it and established a Coast Guard station. Ferries plied the canal until 1931, when the bridge was built, and In 1978, a second bridge was opened. There are 3 shipyards in Sturgeon Bay. Peterson Builders has made everything from wooden, non-magnetic minesweepers for the Navy to an all-aluminum research vessel known as the Alcoa Sea Probe. Bay Ship makes 1,000-foot freighters, and Palmer Johnson caters to the carriage trade, making beautiful yachts and sailboats that sail the 7 seas.
Jacksonport has the distinction of being midway between the equator and the North Pole. 3 miles south of Jacksonport is Cave Point. The shoreline here is sharp rock cliffs that are filled with caves and bluffs and boulders. Here, the cold of the water has interacted with a violent wave action to form large quantities of carbonic acid, which, through the years since the Ice Age, have eaten away this dolomite rock to form these caves. The water rushes in and quickly pours out as a torrential river. Where cliffs have fallen into the water, there are small crevices with frothing whirlpools. The giant waves hit the cliff and the mist shoots 50 feet up, and the sunlight shines through the spray in myriad rainbows. The sound is tumultuous on a summer day, but in a storm it is truly stunning, with waves vibrating the cliff tops and dashing over all. Trees cling tenaciously between the cracks, and gentle, sturdy little alpine flowers bloom purple and peaceful in rocky crevices. This is a well-known area for shipwrecks. In the fall of 1881, during a particularly violent storm, the D.A. Valkenburg foundered on a reef and was held there by blasting waves. The yawl was dropped in the nick of time, only to capsize. The captain was the only man to set foot alive on land when he found himself awash on the rock terrace of Cave Point. The next morning he walked up to Jacksonport to get help in rescuing the Van Valkenburg, but the boat had vanished. Soon parts of it washed in, and the story could be reconstructed. The ship's cargo had been corn, and the waves washing aboard had swelled the corn, and the ship had literally burst at the seams. The local farmers enjoyed the bonus because for a month it washed in such profusion that the entire town of Jacksonport was bursting with plundered corn. Now, on a calm summer or fall day, you can watch skin divers searching off these perilous rocks for treasure. Often their treasure is fishing lures, for these hunters of the sea know the real treasure that lies in these waters.
Of course, even more so, the Port des Morts has the reputation of being the watery grave of more ships than any other area. Death's Door has many legends and some facts that account for this. There is a strong current setting in or out according to the direction of the wind. The coast is rock-bound and certain destruction awaits the craft going ashore. Known as Death's Door, owing to the numerous detached reefs and shoals obstructing its navigation. These words are from the United States Lake Survey Office and Washington sailing directions for Lake Michigan, Green Bay, and the Straits of Mackinac. They know whereof they speak. The heyday of sail saw the greatest concentration of wreckage in the passage. Then, nothing but Rock Island's lighthouse, built in 1837, lit the way. As steamboats came in and the piers of the peninsula were available for refueling, commerce increased, and in 1850, lights were installed on Pilot and Washington Islands. In 1896, on Plum Island, thus lighting Death's Door Passage. Even so, more than 100 ships were wrecked here in 1870 alone. More than 300 are there now, waiting to be found, with cargoes ranging from 1924 Nash and Kissel automobiles to grain, coal, and iron ore.
During the summer of 1979, the steamer Lakeland, carrying the new cars, the Nash and the Kissels, of 1924, was located, and a Rollins model was raised. The lifting damaged it, but it is hoped that others can be brought up and restored. A movie is being made of the project by Belle Richard, the diver who found the ship.
Perhaps a scuba diver may come up with a relic of LaSalle's beautiful Griffin someday. Even now, it is only with electronic depth finders and a good ship-to-shore radio that the intrepid sailor attempts death's door straight.
There are 5 state parks within the boundaries of Door County. The largest of these is Peninsula State Park, with a golf course, the site of Increase Claflin's cabin, and the Indian Monument. Also, there's the Eagle Lighthouse, open for tours and completely restored to its former glory. Rock Island, in its entirety, is a state park. No cars are allowed here. There is a large Icelandic Great Hall, the Park Information Center, with a fireplace large enough to serve dinner for 12 in, and such a dinner was once served there. There is a cemetery, the remains of a school, and a lighthouse, glorious beaches, and some rock carvings of Indians. The ferry at Gill's Rock goes there several times a day. It is a camper's paradise. Above Bailey's Harbor and near the tip of the peninsula is Newport State Park, containing one of the few inland lakes, Europe Lake, with a sand beach and good swimming, plus beautiful Lake Michigan shoreline. Rowley's Bay and the Mink River are the southern borders of this park. Whitefish Dunes State Park, just below Jacksonport, is the newest and is adjacent to Cave Point, the gorgeous Whitefish Dunes, huge lines of evergreen-topped sand mountains, and Clark's Lake, also with good swimming, is on your way. Potawatomi State Park is on the west side of Sturgeon Bay after you cross the bridge and is full of wildlife and rock cliffs on the shoreline. All welcome visitors and have picnic and fire facilities. There are many county parks here, too, and your visit to the door is not complete until you have seen a sunset at Sunset Park on the bay in Fish Creek.
Sun go down to meet the horizon. Oh, it's time for the earth to rest. Sun goes down to meet the horizon. The day is done. Ah, the day is done. Day is done.
World travelers agree that nowhere else can compare with the glorious setting of the sun over the horizon here in Door County.
And after the sun sets, stay a while and watch the lights come on in the dark night sky. Nature has favored our beautiful Door, and you are welcome here